we are not going to succeed if we do it unilaterally or if we go to people and say, you've got to choose between China and us. No, we actually have to invest the time in good old-fashioned diplomacy, do the consulting, and then I think we could work something out, not perfect, but good enough, and it becomes a very different 21st century. If the U.S.-Chinese competition is somewhat muted, and if at least selectively, China works to deal with some regional or global challenges as opposed to either sitting it out or making them worse.
Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. I'm Ian Bremmer. And this pandemic we're living through has been a huge and powerful reminder of just how interconnected we are globally, and how important it is to understand the world around us. Richard Haass is a career diplomat who served in top roles at the State Department, and he's now president of the Council on Foreign Relations. His new book, The World, A Brief Introduction, is about as good a primer as you can get these days, and I spoke to him about it recently, along with other topics. Here's our conversation. Richard, welcome.
Great to be with you, Ian, at least virtually.
Absolutely. Now we'll see each other sooner, I am sure. But let's jump right in. People need to know that you open this book by lamenting that an increasing number of young people, and I guess we don't count in that category anymore, are essentially uninformed about the world they're entering. And so given that the world they're entering is the bleakest in generations, and that, they've got to navigate a job market with 25% plus unemployment right now, all the rest, I mean, why would you argue that an international relations 101 handbook like this is important for them right now?
First, just to set the record straight, I still think of you as a quasi-young person. I am a formerly young person. I just want to clarify that for anyone who might be watching it.
I know, but I hit 50, dude, so it's painful. It's hard to pretend at 50. That's all I'm saying.
I won't even go there.
Okay.
Look, for young people, think about it. If you're just graduating college now, you're in your 20s, your life is essentially a 21st century life. You were born roughly the end of the last century, the beginning of this one. And if you live what we hope will be a normal and longer lifespan, essentially you will track the 21st century. And like it or not, this century is going to have profound, unavoidable effects on your life. This time it's COVID-19. Next time it could be COVID-26. It could be some bacteria that comes along that is resistant to antibiotics. Climate change is a slow motion crisis that is already having an effect and will most likely certainly have much more effects. 9/11 was proof of the effects that terrorists can have. We have by far not heard the last of terrorists. And we can go around, look at the digital. And also, though, Ian, I don't want to paint the picture that global realities are only bad. They can be wonderful things. Your job could be dependent on it. Your ability to travel will return. Obviously, cyberspace brings with it enormous opportunities, be they personal or professional. So globalization is a reality. The world is a reality. How you as an individual, as a business, how we as a country respond to it, that's the realm, that's the domain of choice. But globalization and the world itself, those are realities.
So when you write a book it's called The World, A Brief Introduction, give people, just distill in a sentence or two what your worldview is.
We live in this world where its influence on our lives is profound. And that how we respond, again, is the realm of choice. But to deny the world, let me take a step back. It's not going to be in one or two sentences, but people throw around words like globalist and the rest. Well, if the pandemic teaches us nothing else, it's that what happens in Wuhan, one, doesn't stay in Wuhan, and two, it matters. Climate change matters. Terrorism matters. So let's get serious. And so the point of the book is, again, the world matters. Let's get smarter about it, because the reason I wrote this book is that I believe as citizens, when we vote this November, we ought to make informed decisions. After people are elected, we ought to hold them to account and ask the right questions. As businesses, we're going to have to ask, Do we build a plant in this or that country? Do we export there? You're working on an assembly line, and the president proposes a tariff. Should I support it or should I oppose it? Do I invest in this or that stock? As a career, do I join the CIA? Do I go into the military? Do I become a foreign service officer? Should I send money or go work for Doctors Without Borders or the IRC? In so many ways, these are fundamental questions. And the reason I wrote the book is, and it worries me, is how few Americans, I think, are in a position to make these decisions in ways that they can protect their own and the country's self-interest.
When the conclusion of the book is still pretty much focused on we need the United States to play more of a leadership role. Obviously, the world's changing a lot, not only in terms of the power balance of the United States vis-a-vis other countries, especially China, but also just in terms of what things like free trade, American interventions around the world, immigration policy mean. So when you call for American leadership, what kind of adaptation do you think is required that would allow that to continue to be both a palatable but also an implementable policy?
Look, that's a big foreign policy question. That gets into the issue of how do we respond to the realities. We've got all the old security agenda, rising China, a cranky Russia, North Korea and Iran doing what they're doing. We've got all these new global issues. And the United States is not in a position to simply insist. We're 4% of the world's people. We're maybe a fifth, give or take, of the world's economy. Military force is spread around the world. So my view is simply, if isolationism isn't an answer, nor is unilateralism, we've got to deal with others. And in each area, we're going to have to look to forge the best possible arrangements for dealing with the challenges. In some cases, it may mean taking an existing institution and modernizing it. In other cases, Ian, it may simply mean inventing a new one. And it may mean inventing it with a few other countries. The idea that all, 193 members of the UN General Assembly need to get on every train before the train leaves the station seems to me silly. We're going to have a degree of flexible or designer multilateralism where we bring together those entities, not always necessarily states. It could be companies, it could be NGOs who are like-minded, who are relevant, who are willing and able to work together to tackle a certain problem.
So the U.S. has just announced they're leaving the Open Skies Agreement. You've got they refuse to attend the World Health Organization summit. They're not going to be a part of this global vaccine effort by the WHO and the Europeans. The U.S. Has left the Paris Climate Accord.
It's a long list.
I'm wondering. Is what you're seeing in the Trump administration? It certainly is very different than what you're talking about in your book. Is it 180 degrees opposite of the kind of U.S. foreign policy you want, or are there some areas of alignment?
It might only be 179 degrees different. I don't want to exaggerate it. No, but it is fundamentally different. In some cases, you have denial on things like climate. In some areas, in most areas now, we have an opting out of multilateral arrangements. But the parallel that comes to mind is healthcare. It's one thing to say you don't like Obamacare, but what are you going to put in its place? But what we've had domestically is repeal without replace. What we're beginning to see is the foreign policy equivalent of essentially the United States pulling back or pulling out from all these arrangements, admittedly flawed. I'm not going to sit here and say the WHO deserves an A. It obviously doesn't. Or the WTO or any other organization.
Or the Iranian deal. You and I have debated that a bunch. There were issues with it, no question.
Absolutely. All sorts of flaws. But my view is I'm a pragmatic guy. I'm not very ideological. So my view is, okay, it's flawed. You've only got two options. One, how do we make it better? Or if we can't make it better, or we can't bring it to a level that's acceptable, what else could we bring about? What alternative arrangement might make sense? But to simply pull out and not have an alternative, where does that leave us? How does that give us more influence? How does that in any way protect us from the consequences of this set of events or this trend that is taking place? It also, by the way, leaves the field open for others with whom we disagree, including but not limited to China, in some ways makes it easier for them to fill vacuums that we've created. So even by the administration's own lights, I do not understand the logic of this repeated withdrawal from regional and global arrangements.
Now, obviously, a lot of these institutions are flawed to various degrees. There certainly at some point there's an argument that when an organization truly outlives its useful lifespan, is no longer oriented to serving the problems of the world as it is today, that you need to do something.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering, when you look at institutions that exist around the world today, as broadly disparate as, the WTO and NATO, are there any that you would say, you know what, this thing is just broken now. It's outlived its functional relevance. We need to structurally reform it, or we need to create something new. But it's not just job fare for bureaucrats. Are there places that you would say that's true? And by the way, I'm not suggesting the Council on Foreign Relations is one of those things. I want to be very clear.
Ouch.
Ouch. I'm not suggesting that. I just want to, facts on the table
Wow,
here.
what did I do to hurt you? Your dues, by the way, just went up considerably.
Oh my God.
There's
God.
no such thing as free speech.
I don't even drink when I go there.
There's no such thing as free speech. That's called expensive speech. Look, it's an interesting question. Look, I'm not an expert on it, but let's talk about the WHO. There's real questions about its adequacy for dealing with all sorts of challenges. At the time when HIV/AIDS became central years ago, it clearly couldn't step up. And what we did, the United States, working with other countries, and I want to come back to that phrase, working with others, created new institutions, new arrangements. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which goes back to the late 60s or when it was signed in, say, 1970, is clearly inadequate for dealing with proliferation. So what we've done is in the case of Iran, we then, working with a half dozen other countries, came up with a specific Iran arrangement. Same thing with North Korea. You couldn't depend upon the general agreement. You had to come up with something more tailored for specific conditions. So that seems to me perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable. What I think is critical, though, is the phrase "working with others." Take another area which you and I work on sometimes, which is cyber. It's not so much that their existing frameworks are inadequate; they don't exist. It's kind of a free-for-all out there. Okay, so we don't have to destroy something; we have to create something. Well, let's get together with like-minded countries who, among other things, believe in the openness to ideas, and see if we can set up some ground rules on dealing with that. One of the tragedies of the United States pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was an opportunity to do that with like-minded countries that represented, 45% of the world's economy, in order to set higher standards. And that could have pressured China to raise its game if it wanted to have access. But what's so critical about this is once you decide that something is flawed, is then working hard with others to come up either with a set of reforms or with an alternative arrangement.
This book covers right up to the pandemic. Now, here we are in the biggest crisis, pretty much of our lifetimes. I mean, Cuban Missile Crisis, I guess, is, open as to how. I'm not going there. But I want to know how has now living through the first few months of this pandemic, how has it affected the way you think about international relations going forward? Your level of optimism, your level of, can we handle this? Do we have the resilience? What's the leadership like? I mean, all of this stuff.
The good news, by the way, for me as an author is there is a chapter on global health, and I talk about the possibility of a pandemic. And I underscore that not because I was particularly prescient, but so did a lot of other people. Pandemics were predicted and they were predictable. The specifics obviously were uncertain, which suggests to me we ought to have been more prepared for it. Virtually everything we see going on was identifiable before. The worsening of U.S.-China relations, the weakening of the European Union, essentially moving away from a more integrated union into something less so. North Korea's advance in the area of nuclear weapons and missiles. Iran's beginning to move out of the 2015 nuclear deal. More populism, more nationalism, democracy, and a degree of recession, climate change continuing. So virtually every trend that I saw in the world, I think has continued. What worries me, and to me it's the worst part of this, is you've got all of that, but because of the pandemic, our bandwidth is essentially totally taken. We're looking inward. We're obviously dealing with 20-25% unemployment. So we've got that. It's very hard to make the argument that we should be focused on the world if we're spending trillions of dollars at home. So this combination now that you've got an even worse U.S.-Chinese relationship, potentially a worse U.S.-Russian relationship. You've got all these new security issues. You've got a world that's really needy because of issues you work so much on, issues of debt, the need for relief around the world to help them get through the COVID-19 crisis. But our bandwidth, both our resources and our attention, are essentially have moved inward. That's a really bad combination. So I don't see any one thing because of the pandemic as transformational, but I worry about the weight of having to deal with it. At the same time, we've got to deal with all these other challenges, and that seems to me a really bad combination. The optimist to me would say, well, hopefully people will see this as something of a lesson, and that we do need to think about looking at our arrangements for dealing with future pandemics, for climate change, for any number of global issues, and that's possible. And I'm not ruling that out. But at the moment, it looks like if that were to happen, it's going to happen without the leadership and possibly even the involvement of the United States.
That last caveat, of course, is exactly the opposite of what you're hoping for in the conclusion of your book, so creates a pretty big gap. The last question I want to ask you about is directly on China, because the U.S.-China relationship is eroding so much right now in real time. And I mean, again, I know this is not the best time to be hitting the Chinese. It's a time that we need more coordination, but obviously the Chinese do have a lot to answer for. If you were sitting in your old seat at State Department right now, what would you be trying to push specifically on China?
I would want to cool it a little bit publicly, and I would tell the Secretary of State and others that this is the most important relationship the United States has. Let's start doing a little bit of old-fashioned diplomacy, meet with China to talk about some of the ground rules of the relationship, talk about some specific problems such as North Korea. But I would push back against the Chinese in terms of what they're doing in Hong Kong. I don't much like some other things that are going on domestically. I think on trade, which is not the province of the Secretary of State, but we'd obviously have to push back against intellectual property theft. In some areas, we're just going to have to outcompete China. I can't blame China for wanting to become the global leader, say, in certain technologies. But as an American, I would say, why are we not devoting the kind of share of our GDP that we historically did into basic research? We can compete with anybody if we simply put the resources behind it. My goal with China, Ian, would be to come up with a kind of relationship where we could selectively agree, say on a North Korea, possibly on climate, possibly on some global health reform. At the same time, we inevitably compete. I mean, I'm not naive. I'm not starry-eyed. But the goal ought to be to set up a relationship that doesn't just have one personality, essentially that protects areas of limited cooperation against the backdrop of inevitable rivalry. But we want to mute the rivalry. That means we've also got to talk about such things as Taiwan and so forth, but push the Chinese hard where we need to. But one other thing, it shouldn't be only the United States. What we need to do is lay off beating up on the South Koreans and the Japanese and instead work with them. Chinese are much more likely to be responsive if they have to face a united front of Europe, the United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea, what have you. Suddenly then it's 75% or 70% of the world's economy. It's all this might. Let's do that. Again, I think we need to work out a different relationship with China, and we need to influence Chinese behavior. We are not going to succeed if we do it unilaterally or if we go to people and say, you've got to choose between China and us. No, we actually have to invest the time in good old-fashioned diplomacy, do the consulting, and then I think we could work something out. Not perfect, but good enough. And it becomes a very different 21st century if the U.S.-Chinese competition is somewhat muted, and if at least selectively, China works to deal with some regional or global challenges as opposed to either sitting it out or making them worse.
Richard Haass, he's attractive on the screen, but he's even better on paper. You should buy his book, The World, A Brief Introduction. It is a great primer for everyone for the crazy international society we live in today. Richard, always good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay well.
Avoid people. Yeah. That's what we say. That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Like what you've heard? I hope so. Come check us out at gzeromedia.com and sign up for our newsletter, Signal.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.